Hello, this is the first part of our narrations on Study Unit 1, Introduction to the Law of Things and the Law of Property. In this specific narration, we're going to look at the meaning of property. In the narrations to follow, we'll then focus on the function, the scope, as well as the sources and place of property law.
Now, the term or the concept property is a widely used one that has various connotations. Because of this, it is usually seen as an evasive term, meaning a term that is not easy to define or restrict to a certain and specific meaning. Therefore, we can generally distinguish between two types of usages for the term, namely informal usage and legal technical usage, although, as you will see, these two tend to overlap. Now, when we refer to property in the colloquial or informal sense, we usually refer to rights in legal objects, specifically a person's right in a legal object or my right in a legal object. To use a sentence to illustrate what is meant with this connotation or meaning of property. The umbrella that you are taking is my property. In this sentence, the usage of property is a possessive usage, because property in this sense refers to the fact that the person has a right to the umbrella. So the person that said this, that the umbrella that you are taking is my property, is indicating that he or she has a right to the umbrella. In other words, he or she is indicating that she has a right in the legal object. The second informal usage of the concept property is when property is used to refer to an object itself. So an example of when property is used in this way can be formulated as follows. The agent showed us the property. So that sentence, or this sentence, tells us that property refers to the object, namely the house or the flat that the agent showed to the speaker. In that sense, property refers to an object, or the term property refers to an object. Now, these two examples of how the concept property or the term property can differ depending on the context really emphasizes the contextual nature of the term property. It really depends on the context in which it is used. This is further underscored by the fact that different worldviews or political views or economic ideologies can also influence what we mean when we refer to property in different contexts. Now, the same way in which the concept property is very sensitive and dependent of the context in which it is used, when it is used in colloquial terms, the legal technical meaning of property is also sensitive to context. So to rephrase, in the same way, one cannot ascribe a meaning to the term property in its colloquial or informal sense without taking into account the context in which it is used. Under the legal technical meaning or notion of property, context is also instructive. This is because the term property is influenced by various factors in law. And these various factors are illustrated on the slide. Now, I'll just briefly talk you through these factors. So the first factor there is nature and characteristics. So the nature and characteristics of objects influence the meaning of property, or what is meant with the concept of property in a given context. This is because some objects cannot be property since they do not have the required characteristics or nature to qualify as property. We will have a closer look at which objects or interests qualify as property and what further subcategories of property exists that are important for the law of things. We'll look at this as we deal with the coming study units. But for this purpose, it's important to note that the nature and characteristics of objects also influences what is meant with property in a given context. The second factor there is relationship, specifically the relationship between the object and the legal subject. Now, I want you to remember the example about the umbrella. So, various legal relationships can exist between an object that qualifies as property and a legal subject, a person or a juristic person, in the form of rights. So various legal relationships can exist between these two in the form of rights. And these rights can be use rights, ownership, security rights, and we will look at all these rights in the coming study units as well. The point here is that the specific relationship that a legal subject has over the legal object will also influence what is meant with property in that context. The third factor there, again, is relationships, but this time refers to legal subjects versus other subjects. So the relationship between the legal subject and other legal subject is another important factor that determines what is meant with the term property in a given context. This factor represents the acknowledgement that others may also have rights in the property. And the fact that others may also have rights in the property impacts what is meant with the word property when it is used in that context. If we move on to the fourth factor there, economic and political systems, we must note that changes in political regimes impacts what is meant with property. For example, if a country changes from a capitalist society to a communist society, that would substantially change what is meant with property in our country, not just the law, but also informally. Another factor there, factor 5, refers to commodities. What is important here to note is that what is regarded as valuable in business and economics at a specific time also influence the notion of property. Factor 6 there is constitutional protection. Now, in the constitutional context, the terms property or constitutional property is also used, and objects qualify as constitutional property on a case-by-case basis. Now, constitutional property has in this way widened the ambit of what property can mean in law. Once we have looked at the narrow conception thereof in private law, you will be able to appreciate how constitutional property law has expanded on this concept. So, the fact that we now have something like constitutional property, so interests and objects that can qualify as constitutional property, also impacts what is meant with the term property or when property is used in a given context. And finally, cultural and ideological differences can also impact what is meant with property in a given situation. In this sense, what property means is influenced by, for instance, communal versus private understandings of objects and relationships with objects. For instance, how property is viewed in customary law is different from how it is viewed in private law and also constitutional law. This is because of ideological differences between these laws. Now, the strict legal technical meaning that is ascribed to the concept property must be understood against this contextual background. So the fact that there are these various factors of constitutional nature, of ideological nature, of economic nature must inform, or must be kept in mind rather, when looking at the strict legal technical meaning of property, or the concept of property, and also then how it manifests in various different forms in the legal technical sense of the concept. Now, in strict legal terms, property refers to rights of legal subjects in or over legal objects. The term property is therefore a term used to refer to someone's ability to conduct certain actions with regard to an object. But, as just mentioned, because of the contextual nature of property, even in its legal sense, it can also refer to more than one thing. For instance, it could refer to ownership as an example of a type of right that a person can have over a legal object. It can also refer to the legal object itself. Again, I remind you of the umbrella example that we used. And it can also refer to other legal relationships. For instance, legal relationships recognized in terms of Section 25 of the Constitution as constitutional property. You will have a closer look at this notion of constitutional property when you do Section 25 as a limitation on ownership with Dr. Miller under the study unit Limitations on Ownership. But what you definitely need to understand when thinking about the legal technical meaning of the concept of property is that although there is this strict legal technical meaning, you have to understand it against its contextual background, and therefore you have to appreciate that even in its legal technical sense, the term or concept property can refer to various different things such as ownership, legal objects, and other legal relationships.